Welcome to another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. I'm Dan Proft, morning drive talk show host for AM 560, Chicago's Morning Answer with Amy Jacobson, Monday to Friday, 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. And my guest on this installment is the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute, the leading free market think tank in Illinois, which is the only free market think tank in Illinois. He's John Tillman. John, thanks so much for joining us. And I guess I should disclose that I'm a senior fellow at the Illinois Policy Institute.
And I should disclose, for the sake of the regulators, these opinions will be my own and not those of the Institute.
I just hope to keep my title by the end of this
We'll see
discussion
how it goes,
that we
Dan.
have.
We'll see how it goes.
So the Illinois Policy Institute, you were idle rich, trust fund kid,
Sums
just
up my life
whiling
very well.
away the days,
Yeah,
and you thought,
yeah.
like the idle rich, I'll get involved in public policy because I have nothing better to do. That's basically the genesis of the Illinois Policy Institute. Right?
Well, that was a few years after I almost went bankrupt running a business. Walked out of the bankruptcy attorney office and said, no way, and then decided to try to recover from that, and did, and then decided I want to do something to advance the cause of free enterprise, and particularly entrepreneurs who are amazing heroes to me. And so I decided to get involved in public policy, did a little bit nationally from 2004 to 2007, crazy libertarians, a lot of fun learning experiences. I refer to it as
Citizens Against Government Waste.
no, that was a different group, Americans for Limited Government,
Oh, you were
U.S.
Americans for
term
Limited
limits.
Government.
I was involved somewhat peripherally with,
Alan Keyes was Citizens Against Government Waste, and I always get you two confused.
well, people do, especially when they see us. I used to get confused a lot with Jim Tillman, too. For
Oh,
those-
Jim, because you were
The weatherman. We have the same
and
last
pilot.
name. And, right.
Yeah.
I flew on planes. He actually piloted them.
Similar.
Right.
So, no, but you kind of glossed over it quickly. I do, on a serious note, want to take this back because you are an entrepreneur and you kind of took that entrepreneurial spirit to the public policy arena. And that's something that demands a little bit more discussion. So a little bit of background as an entrepreneur in the private sector, your
Right.
experience before
Right.
you became an entrepreneur in the public policy arena.
So I started my life working for a company in the call center business. So I spent 11 years doing that, and it was actually one of the great life-altering experiences I ever have had. Most of the people that work in the call centers on the telephone have some sort of crisis in their life, financial desperation, to be blunt about it. Nobody takes a call center job on purpose. You do it because you can make a lot of money in a short period of time, especially back in the 80s when I got started doing this. And so I got to have real exposure to the challenges of the human condition, how people struggle, how they have ups and how they have downs, how they make mistakes, how they try to recover from them. One of the things we learned very early on is what sets somebody apart to be a potential great salesperson was they had to have the right motivation. Financial desperation is a tremendous motivator, Dan. I don't know if you know that.
Yes.
And actually, I do know that you know that.
Yes.
Yes. And so I spent 11 years doing that, and I learned a lot about leadership and management, and really a lot about how, for example, when I came to Chicago, I was in Detroit, then Washington, D.C., and then I came to Chicago to run a facility out in Oak Park. And I started to actually understand school choice for the first time in my life. We had 80 employees. About 60 of them were white, 20 of them were black. A few years later, we had 300 employees. Roughly 250 were black and 50 were white. And what we did is opened up the recruiting avenues into the west side and south side of Chicago. And you know what the desperation was there? It was a little bit of money, but it was public education. People were trying to save money. Their motivator for getting the job was to save money to get their kid into a private school and still stay in Chicago, or to get their move out into a suburban school district. And it was a really early revelation for me about public policy.
And so then the call center business.
Call center business, I did that for 11 years.
And then you ran your own business.
I ran my own business. I started my first business in 1993 in the Play It Again Sports franchise system. So a little bit like owning McDonald's, but no hamburgers. Used sports equipment. We sold new sports equipment and used sports equipment. I had two stores, one in Skokie and one in the city of Chicago. I opened the Skokie store first, Dan, and that was a good choice. I paid the village of Skokie $50 and I never heard from the village again, or an alderman. I opened my store.
Simpler times in Illinois.
Simpler times.
Yes.
And then I opened my store in Chicago, and interesting things happened, Dan.
You got to become acquainted with your local officials and with government
They were there to help
regulation.
me by...
Well, I assume, as is often the case, they knew more about your business than you did.
That is exactly correct, yes.
they were
And
gonna help you.
so I'll get to the finishing of the Play It Again business. I owned those two stores up through 2007, then eventually closed one eventually, and then sold the second one. And but the funny part about working in the city of Chicago, the alderman's guy showed up and said, we'd like to put the alderman's sign in your window, and we're having this quarterly fundraiser. And I said, oh, no, I'm not political. I just want to run my business here in the neighborhood. I live here in the neighborhood. So I know, it was so cute, wasn't it?
It's so innocent.
Little old naive me.
Yeah.
And then we kind of went back and forth. And he was pretty aggressive. And I was very surprised by this because I was naive. And I finally said, no, I just don't want any political signs in my window. I just want to serve the community. And he looked at me and he kind of gave me that look, which should have been a clue. Okay, then, and walked out. A few weeks later, the HVAC inspector showed up. The electrical inspector showed up. The sign inspector showed up. They have a driveway inspector in the city of Chicago. You know how your concrete intersects with the city streets? There's actually an inspector to see if you're doing that just right. And by the way, there are fees for all these things that added up to over $10,000 by the time I added it all up. That was my first experience into a different aspect of public policy in the city of Chicago. Anyway, I did that through 2007, sold off the business, got involved actually simultaneously in 2004, as I mentioned earlier, with the national work with Americans for Limited Government and some other organizations. And then in 2007, when I was getting it kind of out of the play-to-game business in its entirety, I sat in my extra bedroom and wrote a business plan to try to build a pro-free market movement here in Illinois.
Well, I mean,
how dreamy is that?
Well, so interesting because, I mean, it's important to note that you were a practitioner as a small business owner-operator before you got into the public policy arena, because I think the take on this is, politicians, once they retire or are de-elected, then they go run a think tank, or they, it's just a sinecure. And
the clouds help me look better on camera, right, Dan?
Yeah, they do. But I mean, you were a bootstrapper in the private sector, and then you take over the Illinois Policy Institute, which is an organization that existed, but it was very small when you took it over, and you essentially applied those business principles to building this organization and this brand in advance of free minds and free markets in Illinois.
That's exactly right. And I think that it is worth spending a moment on that because people have a perception of who you are today. And they don't.
You've always been that person.
Always been that person.
You've always been in this
You've
perch.
not evolved, earned anything,
Right.
worked hard. You must have started out on third base. And I'm certainly not, I don't even think of myself as being on third base. I'm just hoping to dive into first base on a bunt single at any moment, right? But people have their perceptions. So I was in that call center business, and I was making good money. I worked my butt off, and I was earning good money. And I decided I wanted to open my own business. I decided it was going to be in the sporting goods field. I love sports. I was single at the time. I wanted to do something that involved kids, little league, and all that sort of thing, youth hockey, youth football, and because we serviced those customers.
Right.
And so I started saving money. And let me tell you what I did. I moved out of my fancy apartment, sold my fancy car, and moved into a basement apartment, shared an apartment for the first time in my life with a roommate, and cut my monthly expenses to less than $800 a month.
And this you were how old at the time?
I was 30-ish, 30-ish,
So
31.
it's not like you're a snot-nosed kid out of high school
No,
or just out of college.
No, right. And so I rode the L every day, and I massively cut my expenses. My wife, to her great credit, when I decided to do this, I said, I'm going to move out of everything. I'm going cash is king. I'm not spending any money, and if you want to dump me now, it's not a bad time, so you might want to consider that. To this day, it's her greatest mistake she's ever made.
Yeah,
it's not saying yes to that at the time. But she stuck with me, and I saved a lot of money. I was able to accumulate a lot of cash because I was earning a lot of money, and I saved all the capital to start that business. Had a little small loan, and I put it all in the pot to start these stores. And I remember what it was like when I opened my second store, and then I ran into financial difficulties. I made some mistakes, Dan. I don't know if you know this happens with entrepreneurs. It's not a straight line to success. I almost went bankrupt because at one time I had enough inventory for 3 stores, but I only owned 2 stores. That creates cash flow problems and almost made me go bankrupt. Oh, and in the middle of that, I started another business in the public internet access business during the dot-com boom. So this is what crazy entrepreneurs do. And I almost blew it all up, and it was a very difficult experience. And that's partly why I have such passion for what you do and what I do every day, and what all the people that we work with all the time do, is people who go out and try to start a business really are doing a society a favor, but they're heroes. And it's not just them, it's the people they employ, the first job they give to somebody that may have never had a job. They take some kid off the street who's in high school or college, give him his first work at a wage that is fair, low, hopefully, because he has no skills. I had no skills when I started.
This kid just graduates from Princeton. He has no skills.
Right.
He needs a job to get into the workforce.
I wish I'd graduated from Princeton. Didn't have that degree. You, Northwestern, if I remember right.
Yes.
Yeah. You had all the advantages, that privilege of yours.
yes.
But the
and all the debt that
and all the debt.
companies
Are you still working on that?
No.
Yeah. Oh, thank God you've paid that off. It was much smaller back then.
Yes, but right, sure, of course, because it's subsidized. You have Northwestern, I think, was $25,000 a year when I went in the early '90s, and now it's $60,000 a year.
God, that's amazing. Isn't that amazing? I don't think that's keeping pace with inflation. I think it's winning.
No, it's far surpassing inflation.
But to just finish that. Well, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, but I want to get to that because I think that informs a perspective that you've brought to free market policy discussion in this state that was heretofore maybe not totally absent, but it wasn't amplified like it is today, thanks to your work and the Illinois Policy Institute's work. So I want to get to that, but I want you to explain the transition from being that private sector entrepreneur and then the inspiration to take up the think tank and construct this plan that you referenced and build this out?
Well, I had for a long time been fascinated by politics. I always joke that I'm the only 9-year-old in 1968 who watched both political conventions pretty much gavel to gavel and thought it was great. Both my brothers thought I was an idiot, and they were probably right. I mean, I still like sports, but I thought politics was a fascinating game. I was a political science minor in college, and so as you rolled through life and I had all these experiences and I saw government harming, I saw what happened at one point when I had my stores, and I'd already started this other business in the public internet access world. So I put everything in and then some. I signed on to a lot of dotted lines and created a lot of leverage, if you will. And I raised some money from friends and others. So I had other people's money on the line too, and with this public internet access business. And so I'm trying to run these two businesses. In the middle of that, the roof on my Chicago Play It Again store collapsed. Not to the ground, but the trusses failed. Roof is coming down. Had dropped 2.5 feet over 12 hours. Had to evacuate the store. Emergency trusses put in and supports. And should have taken about 6 weeks to repair it and put it all back together. But the builder I hired was not in good standing with the city of Chicago. Told me he got a permit and didn't. I discovered this when they showed up one day and said, "You don't have a permit for this." I said, "Oh my God, how's that possible?" Anyway, long story short, they didn't like my builder, and so they slow walked my permit, and it took me 8 months to repair that building and get the city of Chicago to sign off on the repairs.
By the way, you may say it permit in Michigan. We say permit here in Chicago. I just thought I'd introduce.
Thank you for that.
How we
say it
here.
different. We say it different here,
okay.
or there. Some of the habits of growing up in Michigan, I've been saddled with my whole life.
Insurance. We just say insurance here.
No, I say insurance.
Right. It's just insurance.
Right. Okay.
Permit.
Thank you.
It's one syllable.
So can I get a tape of this so I can go back and look it over and learn a little bit?
On phonics lesson
it would be very helpful to me. And so, the city of Chicago was hostile. They didn't care about this guy who they didn't know, who wasn't writing big enough checks. Oh, by the way, I didn't finish the story on that alderman. The guys that all showed up and these things. I'm not sure if I told you this earlier, right?
You know him today as former Mayor Richard M.
No, a former alderman. But all those guys showed up, and I went down to the alderman's office. By the way, I had to spend a lot of money to fix all these horrible problems with my electrical and HVAC because I was in violation of the city code.
Right.
Well, then I went down to the alderman and said, I would actually like to support your campaign. And I wrote a check. And it all went away, Dan. I didn't have to do anything. I just had to write those checks.
Coincidence.
That's how the city of Chicago works. So I backtracked, but the point of all this is that the city was hostile to a small business just trying to serve people and eke out a living. And then I saw how it worked in Skokie, which actually was extremely well run. It was very simple. You write your check, you do your thing, you pay your taxes, and you move on. And it really struck me. So I decided I wanted to get involved in public policy. I'd been an addict, as I implied earlier, by my youth and my starting out as a political science minor in college. But then I ignored it for most of my life. Like a lot of people, I went on to try to build my career. So by the time I got to my mid-40s, I thought, I want to try to get engaged in this arena because we are unbelievably blowing it as a culture, as a country, and frankly, the right, I thought, was blowing it. And I was particularly taken with, because I'm a marketer by nature and training, and I was really struck by we have the greatest force for good ever created in the human sphere, which is free enterprise and the founding principles of individual liberty in this country. And we're selling it like it's cancer. The other side is actually selling cancer and people are buying it. And it really made me angry. And so I wanted to get involved and try to bring what I like to call a marketing-centric approach to selling all that we believe in. And so that's what I've been trying to do at the Institute ever since, and we've recruited amazing people to help do that.
And so now you're what, almost a decade in at Illinois Policy Institute?
On July 2nd, 10 years.
Yeah, and Illinois over that decade has not markedly improved, as we're on the precipice of being the first and only junk-rated state in the nation. So how do you explain your failure?
Well, first of all, I shouldn't have partnered with you because when I joined forces with you, things started to auger
rookie
in.
mistake.
Yes.
Yeah.
See what
rookie
happened?
mistake.
I was told that you were going to be the best there was to partner with in this arena.
Another false savior.
And look what happened.
Yeah.
Look what happened. So I've been really just trying to dislodge myself from this relationship for some time, and actually that's the purpose of this interview.
Yeah, I kind of hang on. I'm kind of like Luke Perry in 8 seconds.
Right.
I know,
As if I saw the movie.
Right.
I will never get any of the. You got to get more popular than Luke Perry and whatever the hell that was.
Well, I mean,
But did
Beverly
20
Hills
million?
90210. I mean,
that was for other people.
Well,
I was busy saving money to start a business back then.
it's for people of a certain age that
Well, I'm way
is
above that
significantly
age.
younger than your age.
That's true.
But so,
But it is- but
so
it's
the decade
yeah.
of your experience. I mean, so to be serious, you've built this. You and your team have built this juggernaut of free market principles and policy, and you produce great content that distills down a lot of complicated issues, that provides the data and says to people, here's the information, choose your course. But over the last decade, and frankly, of course, this precedes Illinois Policy Institute under your leadership, people have been, as you say, choosing cancer over individual liberty and free market principles. And so, in addition to the obvious frustration, what's your takeaway a decade in?
My takeaway is that, first of all, this is very difficult, and I knew it was not going to be an overnight success story. This was going to take a long time. The very first donor I went to in the summer of 2007 and asked for a significant amount of money asked me how long it would take. And I said, kind of off the cuff, the governor will change hands in 2014, and it did. Now, I would love to say that I was a great prognosticator, but I knew that in 2007, the odds in 2010 were slim. This was pre-Tea Party. And I thought 2010 is too soon, 2018 is too far. It was like porridge. I'll take 2014 and say that'll be when. Well, but circumstances actually did change. And so we monitor and measure public sentiment and obviously voting trends and all the rest of it. And the trend lines actually in that sense are all heading our way. The difficulty is that
you've been right about every state in the Midwest except Illinois.
Exactly. Did I mention that?
Yeah.
But the point is that the voting differences between Democrats and Republicans are actually a lot tighter. People forget that Republicans won every statewide office in the state. You will know the numbers better than me, from 2002, prior to 2002, back for like 28 years. The statewide, it's generally a red state, and the rest of the state offsets Cook County. And then what happened is George Ryan destroyed the Republican brand. His corruption destroyed the brand, and you had this trough, lack of resources. I was always back when I first started, I always say we were
bad candidates, bad campaigns.
Bankrupt morally, ethically, financially, and from a policy point of view. So there was no leadership. And the reason I started this whole thing was to try to provide some leadership in the policy arena and the idea that ideas matter. And so
and it's important to know, just to provide that historical context. So George Ryan implodes after his election in '98, goes to jail in the first part of the century, and then we go through this Israelites wandering in the desert for the intervening 15 years to present, when you put this plan together and kind of re-engineer and relaunch the Illinois Policy Institute at the height of Rod Blagojevich, even while he was under federal investigation and winning a second term.
Well, and let's go back to that a little bit. So when I put the plan together, I went back and looked at every single house, all 118 districts. I looked at every one of them from 2000 through 2006. I looked at our 2002 through 2006, and I looked at every Senate race, 59 Senate districts. And as the Democrats ran up their large majorities, it wasn't like suddenly the state turned blue. It was I think you say this all the time, people left the field of play on the right. And so there was an absence of competition from the right during the Ryan run-up. Because that started.
Republican voters retired.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because they were embarrassed by the brand, as they rightly should have been, because it was an embarrassing brand at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it was George Ryan was corrupt, and the Republican Party, by the way, was simply the junior partner to Madigan's law firm of fleecing the people of Illinois. which continues to this day. And so the whole problem was that you had Republicans abandoning the field of play. You had ideas being abandoned. And so there was only one narrative, which was the left's narrative and Madigan's narrative and the media that fuels that. So my whole
And Republicans starting from the left's premise.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Nobody was putting a marker out on the other side about a pro-freedom, pro-free enterprise, pro-liberty point of view, which is what we set out to do. And my argument from the very beginning was if you put a stake in the ground, run a flag up it, that people will rally to that cause. And despite the fact that we're in this current situation, that has largely been true. First of all, we have a Republican governor. I think you're aware of that.
Yes.
We have a Republican governor. He's in deep trouble right now, but it's recoverable. And but he won in 2014 because he ran against everything we're talking about. He ran against the establishment, what was the bipartisan establishment. He set himself apart from that. I think he needs to go back to that.
He frankly did what Reagan did in the 80s. He ran against the establishment of both parties. Both parties. It wasn't my party right or wrong. It was this established power structure doesn't work. It is, as you suggested before, bankrupt morally and in every other way. And so, no, I'm not. This is kind of post-partisan in a way. I'm not going to be part of this established power structure that's destroying the city of Chicago, that's destroying the state of Illinois' economy and economic opportunity for Illinois families. I want to chart a different course. That was Rauner in 2014.
Right, and that if he gets back to that, he's going to win, because that is still a winning strategy. It's why Trump won, and it's all of our research, which you're involved in as well, all of our research with voters show that still resonates because it's still true. Yeah. And the important thing to remember in framing this, and again, this goes back to why Rauner was successful in 2014 and what we've tried to do. People always say we're this right-wing think tank. 46% of our audience consider themselves moderate to liberal. 46% of our audience. Now, we purposely target the middle and soft left because we're trying to persuade. We're not trying to, butter up the bread of the right. We love the right. That's, what people would consider our base. But we're trying to persuade people that our ideas are the best way to help the poor and disadvantaged. Our ideas are the best way to help people have mobility and rise. Our ideas are the best way to help create independence, a great education, and all the rest of it, personal prosperity and opportunity. And the other thing we always try to emphasize that I like to talk about is when we talk about prosperity, it's actually the left who is fixated on money and material things. We're not talking about that, though it's important and it's part of the conversation. We're talking about human fulfillment, about setting people free, the human spirit that resides within each of us. Are you better off being somebody on the south or west side of Chicago dependent on the government class to dole out your benefits every 2 years because they want your votes? Or should you be set free to be an independent, autonomous person and community? That's what we're fighting for. They're fighting to keep them within that framework, and I think it's a shame.
So Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson was just in town for dinner in the suburbs, and he made this point. The way that he expressed the point that you're making is, this is Ron Johnson speaking, I talk to high school students and college students as a routine part of my job as U.S. Senator to get around the state of Wisconsin. And I always ask the same question. Raise your hand, anyone who wants to be 30 years old and living in your parents' basement, dependent on your parents. Raise your hand. And he says, of course, thankfully, to this point, no one has ever raised their hand because no one aspires to dependency, whether it's on your parents or whether it's on the state. And so the idea that, there's a problem in this state because people want government protection at the expense of human fulfillment, as you're saying, is a canard. That's
right.
Not what people want, but in the absence of a accessible way forward that says we're going to help you find your way to maximize your skill sets, to maximize your potential, they say, well, in the absence of that, in the absence of obvious pathways to opportunity, I'm going to take what I can get now because I need to take what I can get to survive. So it's not demagoguing the poor. It's not demagoguing or denigrating people that are on, that are the beneficiaries of transfer payments in the short term. To some extent, you can say, well, that's a failure of the welfare state because it's soul crushing and it creates permanent dependency. But to another way of thinking, it's a failure of the Republican Party to point that way forward, to say, walk away from the siren song of that transfer payment check, and walk towards the light, if you were, of your own independence on your own terms, because we can match up we can provide skill sets, opportunities to access them and develop them, and then point the way forward once you've obtained them to an independent life where you are successful on your own terms doing whatever it is you want to do.
Right, and by the way, none of those things rule out the idea that we all want to have a compassionate society that helps people who can't help themselves, or helps people when they stumble and fall down. That happens to all kinds of people. What the left does is tries to pitch
it almost happened to you. Just to personalize it.
Well, it almost happened to me in multiple. It did happen to me when I was a kid. Some of the background of my life, and it's the other thing that's always amusing to me. When people have this perception of who you are and what you've lived, and they have no idea the life you've lived. And I've been through some things, and I know what it was like to be poor. I know what it was like to have a mother dependent on the welfare state, and how horrible that was, and how it changed her, and how it changed her character, how it was a corrosive, and how, as a kid, a teenager, a young kid, how horrible it was to watch that dependency grip her and choke the life and the spirit out of her. And that's why I focus on the human spirit, because that's what it does. And our ideas, as I said earlier, are the best way to help improve the human condition for everyone, but especially the poor and disadvantaged. And we need to make that argument, not because, as a governor from Ohio, it might make him feel good to talk about that, but because it's based in truth. And this is one of the things I think that's going on in this city that is just unbelievable, what's going on in this city. And in the west side and the south side, and the carnage that is going on. And everybody's absent. Everybody's absent. Where's the Democrats? Where's the Republicans? Where are they? Everybody should be in there fighting for their point of view. More dependency, or unleash the potential of everybody by creating conditions that, they're all focused on identity politics.
Yeah.
We need to be focused on opportunity politics. They're focused on equality of outcome. We should be focused on fairness of getting access to opportunity.
And so I want to develop this more, because you're the best in the state at talking about the human cost or benefit of good versus bad public policy. With the exception of myself.
Right. Well, you didn't need to tell me
Obviously,
that. I already knew that.
I like to state things that are obvious, just in case, just so there's no confusion.
Right.
So I want to pick up on this point, because outside of me, obviously, you are the best person in the state talking about the human cost or benefit of good versus bad public policy. And you tell a story that I've heard you tell just a couple of times that most people haven't heard, which I think really brings it home. And it's about an issue that I'm just pounding away on this cycle as we've done the research. It's property taxation, and how Illinois is becoming a home equity desert, and how you actually have government effectively taking people's homes away from them through property taxation, and you have them effectively precluding, in particular, minority families, because it's down socioeconomic spectrum. The impact metastasizes. It's more negative as you go down the socioeconomic spectrum. They're essentially precluding minority families in places like Chicago and South Suburban Cook County from property ownership, which is the most underrated and underreported story in Illinois. And I want you to tell the story of property taxation and how it became so real in human terms for you.
Well, I'm a bit of a weeper like John Boehner, so I'll try to get this story out with my tough alligator exterior. But I did allude to the fact that I lived a few things. So my parents were married, got divorced when I was very young, under 10. There's actually an argument among my brothers as to how old we all were when this horrible event occurred. And this was back when my dad was an executive for Gerber Baby Foods, first executive to get divorced. It was a big deal in a little town of 3,500 people where they're headquartered in rural West Michigan. And so parents get divorced. Bad things start to happen, as you've heard. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's not good.
Yeah.
Bad things happen. And so we went from having a very lovely life to having a very challenging life. And my mom was, by that time, a single mom with 3 kids. My dad had moved out of state. Eventually reconciled with my dad, and was all good. But during this time, we were sort of alone. And my mom was working as a retail sales clerk. And the property taxes at that time, the number's going to sound inconsequential, but let me tell you, back in the early 70s, late 60s, this was a huge number for someone working a retail sales clerk job. Property tax were $350 for this house that was worth maybe $35,000 at best. And my mom accumulated that money in cash. and would save throughout 12 months to get that money together to make the property tax payment. We had this piece of furniture we called a hutch. It was an old piece of furniture back during the good days when we bought it, and it held, the dining room chime and all that, but eventually deteriorated into a big top right drawer was our junk drawer. And in that junk drawer was where she kept the money. A little rubber band around it, and it would sit there, and it'd start out at the beginning with $20 or $30 in it, and over the course as month would go by, she'd make a little $5 spiff from having made a sale, put the $5 in there, and the tension would rise when the property tax payment would come due, and you're at $290. Now $60 was a lot of money, and I remember many times going into that drawer with my mom or my brothers, but especially my mom and I, and adding it up and seeing where we were, and literally going out to the couch in the little den where we watched TV, and going through the cushions, and went out to the car and looked in the seats for coins to try to get to $350. And it was sometimes touching. We always made it. We always made it. And I think one or two times she had to borrow some money from her sister, who was pretty well off. But most of the time we got there on our own, and then she would make that property tax payment. And that feeling of relief, because you know what she knew is if she didn't make that property tax payment, the government would take away her house. It was very real. And that house was all she had. It was all we had. And I remember that deeply to this day. And I think about the people in this state who pay the highest property taxes in the country. And I think about people like my mom, who might be a single mom, or maybe a widowed dad, or whatever, a married couple who are just trying to get by to pay their $4 or $5 or $10 or $15,000 property taxes. And as you always point out, the taxes keep going up every year. And so where does that money come from? It comes out of the tutoring lessons for the son who doesn't read very well, or the kid who's trying to do better at math, or the kid who wanted to play football but can't afford the fees because they got to make that property tax. These are real things that are happening to people in this state right now. Not just one or two people, but tens and hundreds of thousands of people right now. And you wonder why we have out-migration. It's because people eventually look around and go, I could move to Indiana and cut my property tax by a half to 2/3 and live in a better house. And oh, by the way, the schools are pretty good. And as you always point out, there's fire departments and everything.
Yeah.
There's police forces.
Get the whole thing.
And so this is a real thing. One of the things I always like to talk about is that you have to explain public policy at the point it intersects somebody's life. It intersected my life over those many years by opening up that drawer, looking in that little corner where that pile of cash was, and counting it and seeing if we had enough. And we usually didn't. And we had to scramble to get there.
And knowing what that date was.
Knowing what that date was, and it's like a big thing looming over you. And I remember so many stories that how it affects you. I played basketball, and I remember the sacrifice that we had. You had to have Adidas. I can't remember the model now, but it was the Adidas shoe. You might remember what it was. It was the basketball shoe, and you had to have that pair of shoes. You couldn't play basketball, and it was up to you to come up with the money. It was incredibly expensive to buy those shoes, and I remember the day my
Probably
mother...
in your day, it was like, I don't know, Oscar Robertson or...
It was something like that.
I mean, it's
yeah.
just like going
back
way
in my
back.
day.
Yeah,
I mean, George Mikan, for God's sake.
Dr.
Right.
James Naismith is the first Adidas James
Right, his
Naismith
picture
brand.
was actually right there on the tongue.
I mean, you're playing some peach baskets.
But the day that she came home with those shoes, she was so happy. She cobbled enough money together to buy me those shoes so I could play basketball. And
that's a big deal because you were a terrible athlete.
Well, not only was I a terrible athlete, I mean, the end of we called ourselves the scrubs. I mean, we were at the end of the bench.
Right.
But boy, could we cheer.
Not ironic.
Right. By the way, my shoes
Descriptive.
never wore out.
Right. Well,
because I didn't play much.
But I mean, that's that's the thing about it,
But I wanted to play.
And
it was a lifesaver for me.
And this is, when you talk about this, like, oh, this is a bygone era when Tillman was growing up in the 60s and 70s.
It's happening right now.
Exactly.
It's happening right now. There are people right now while we're talking at this table who are sitting around making a decision about whether they're going to stay in this state and try to continue to pay the freight for the incompetence and malpractice and, frankly, immorality of the political class in the state who've screwed them over. There are perhaps thousands of people having that discussion right now. And you know what people are doing? Nothing. And we have to do it ourselves. There's nobody else that's going to do it. The people have to do it.
And so when, and I've mentioned this before on this show, the highest effective property tax rate as a percentage of home value in Cook County is in Fort Heights, which is one of the poorest communities in the state of Illinois, in the country of the United States. 10.5% of property value. So you basically eliminated the possibility of home ownership unless you want to pay for your home every 3 years just on property taxes over and over and over again. So why have we not, as free market types, forget the party affiliation, in terms of our policy solutions to improve people's lives, we haven't made the case. We haven't sold those families that our ideas are the best way forward for them.
Well,
And so why haven't we done that?
I think, well, I'll go back, well, I'll talk about, we are doing that. You're doing that. Our team at the Illinois Policy Institute is doing that. We're trying to do that, but there's a couple of key points here, and as to why, because you can't do it alone, right? You can't do it alone. You need a lot of people to come together to make change against the Leviathan that is the state. That, remember that the state, make sure I don't lose train of that, but let's remember who the other side is. The other side is the Leviathan that is the state. And their business model is to keep this system going that screws the people in Fort Heights. And the reason is because the people that benefit from the current status quo that is bankrupting the state are people who are involved in government as employees. Now, it's not the individual employee who is at fault here. It's the politicians that sanction it. They're the ones who are accountable. But nevertheless, the structure is that public employees are draining resources from helping the poor and disadvantaged, from educating our children, building world-class universities, high schools, infrastructure, and all the rest of it that allow the rest of us to live. The salaries, the pension benefits, the post-employment benefits, the health care, work for the state for 30 years, you get free health care the rest of your life. Everybody has that, right?
20 years.
20 years, I'm sorry, right. 20 years, right? Dropped to a decade there. The system rewards itself by extracting wealth and income from people in Fort Heights and everywhere else in order to fund all of that. Oh, by the trial bar, they also benefit, which means you have a bad workman's comp, which is a very complicated policy, but basically what it means, it's a hostile business environment for people to operate businesses because you get sued a lot for false claims in workers' comp as opposed to the ones that we should protect, which are legitimate claims. That's why they're all aligned to keep this system going. And the reason that our side isn't making the argument, and we haven't got there all the way yet, is because of the mindset of former Senator Mark Kirk. I met with him in August of 2009, prior to him running for Senate the first time in 2010. And I was making this exact argument to him. You know, the right has to reach out to African Americans, to Hispanics, and generally speaking to the poor and disadvantaged who are being screwed by this system. And his comment to me was endemic of what the problem was then and largely still is to this day. John, the cost per vote is too high. Now think about that from just a transactional political thinking point of view. That is an outrageous statement. And it also reflects that it's all about the political machinations as opposed to improving the human condition. What we need are visionary politicians to adopt these same ideas that we're talking about and lead on them. Because it does take somebody in the political arena to pick up these ideas and run with them in the way that we are in the public policy and cultural debates. So we've made the ground, one of the things we talk about a lot is our job is to make the ground fertile for these ideas, to open up the doors and possibilities of selling these ideas and to provide the ways to sell it. But in the end, you've got to find politicians, and everybody watching this show should say, who are the politicians who will take this baton and run with it? And Rauner's dabbling with it. He's not all the way there yet, but I've talked to him enough to know his heart's in the right place. He needs to put a team together that is fully embracing of this, top to bottom. And by team, I mean the entire infrastructure. I'm not talking about one person. I'm talking about the entire political infrastructure on the right has to commit to this because it will work with these audiences we're talking about. It'll also work with your base because this is about opportunity for all people, not identity politics.
So are there examples where weeds have grown through the concrete that could be nurtured?
Yes, I think there are examples. I think there's a restlessness, without naming names, there's a huge restlessness in the African American community in the city of Chicago. They are completely disaffected, disenfranchised from the political structure. They don't like Mike Madigan. They don't like Rahm Emanuel. They don't like the results of all of their policies that have been going on for decades. But the problem is no one's coming with an alternative. So it's sort of like, you know, the bird in the hand versus two in the bush. Right now, the bird in the hand is the sort of dependency thing you talked about earlier. That's a known thing, and it's been going on for a long time. So all the influencers and power brokers in these communities know that that's the currency. You've got to provide an alternative currency. And you've got to remember, it takes risk for them to make this leap. But you don't need to win them all. You don't need to win a majority. You simply need to shave off a few to change the entire political equation and thus the dynamics.
Do we need to do a better job? And this is my argument on property taxes, so this is kind of a leading question. Do we need to do a better job of providing them with the data? Here's what's actually happening. Here's how you're getting scammed. The Fort Heights property tax system in Linwood, down in South Suburban Cook County, the effective property tax rate on residents is about 3.1%, which is almost 4 times the national average. That's for residential property taxpayers. For businesses, 9% of property value for their commercial property. So who would locate a business or expand a business in Linwood when they can skip over 10 minutes and do the same in Indiana for a fraction of the cost? And so that forestalls economic opportunity for those communities that need it the most. And the problem, of course, is that, well, that requires working with people to connect the dots in the face of what you hear from the left, from these men of always from the Democrat Party, of here's a check, I'm for you. You know, they, as you like to say, they get to participate too, and
Right.
they continue to run the same scams, couched in the same rhetoric, because why wouldn't they? It's been working.
Well, it's been working for a long time, but here's what's interesting about that is the predicate you have to start to move this is you have to have sort of that emotional, visceral, intuitive understanding on the part of the people you're trying to reach. Whether it's somebody in rural Illinois, somebody in suburban Illinois, say Long Grove. Go look at the property taxes in Long Grove. Compare a house in Long Grove where they're out of the, I mean, it's unbelievable how high property taxes are in Long Grove. One of the things you always point out is how it depresses your value. It destroys your equity.
Right.
The higher your property tax is, the less equity you have because your sale value becomes less. And you compare that to other places. It's not just black versus white, urban versus suburban or rural. It's happening to everybody. But in these particular communities, they already know. What we have to do is that point you made a moment ago is do a better job of connecting the dots on the causation. And that's where we have not spent enough time, and we're trying to spend that time now. I had a phone call, I think it was 2 years ago now, from a guy from the south suburbs, and I'm not going to use his name because he works for the government and his career would be destroyed if I said his name, or if I said his name. But if either way.
Yeah.
But if I said his name, it would be bad for him. But he invited me to come down and meet with some of his neighbors. Now, at the time he called me, I had no idea what his race was, what his situation was. I didn't know anything. The community that he's from could be anything, right? I went down and I walked into a room and it was about 18 to 20, all African Americans. And it was one of the most fascinating discussions I've ever had.
In what community?
South suburbs.
Okay.
But Homewood, Flossmoor, that general neck of the woods. And
Which, not in the not too distant past, were some of the most affluent communities, not in the south suburbs, in the Chicagoland area. They were on par with Winnetka, New
great school
Kenilworth,
system. Oh
Highland
my God.
Park,
It was the creme de la creme.
Flossmoor, Olympia Fields.
Exactly, that area. And so I walk in, and we were just getting acquainted, never met these people before, and so we just sort of did this introduction, and we went around the room, and everybody kind of told their story, and it went like this. I moved here 20 years ago to live the American dream. I wanted to get a great school system for my kids, wanted to raise my kids in a great community, and now I don't know if I can stay here. My property taxes are $18,000 a year. When I bought my house, it was $600,000. Now it's worth $450,000. If I wanted to sell it, I couldn't. And it just went on and on and on. Every story was exactly like that. They know that they're being screwed by the system, and they're totally frustrated. They're totally frustrated with Democrat leadership that has bankrupted their communities. And they're wondering why no one on the other side, meaning the governor and Republicans in general, are coming to make an argument. Who's going to help us figure out how to get out of this? And I spent an amazing 2 hours. And by the way, there was a local government official there who happened to be white, who happened to be a Democrat, who was trying to tamp it all down, tamp down the revolution. I mean, it was the seeds of revolution. And this guy was there because he's part of the machine, and he was trying to tamp it down. And the dynamic was just fascinating. There is such a vein of opportunity to unleash the human spirit that lives within everybody in these communities and to protect them from the voracious appetites of the establishment. And it is waiting for political people to pick up that baton and run, and that's what we all have to keep doing.
And so, but in terms of the landscape as it currently exists, the Chicago Democrat crime families have us in a bit of a trick bag, don't they? On the one hand, we're trying to outreach to people that haven't previously been affiliated with our idea matrix. So we're trying to do that outreach in difficult terrain.
Right.
And at the same time, we're losing ground in middle to upper middle income suburbs and those suburban families who we have to have in order to advance a economic liberty policy agenda. So is there a unifying argument to be made? And I would submit that property taxes is it, because you're all experiencing the same thing to varying degrees. But Democrats have been successful at kind of manipulating that, on the face of it, apparent trick bag that we're in.
So it's only a trick bag if you allow the other side to define the terms of play. And our side has done that for far too long. The arguments that you have to make in South Cook are the same arguments you have to make in the suburbs you just talked about. They're the same arguments. You make them differently. People are living different lives. It's not the same.
Right.
But it's the same underlying premise, which is they are out to fleece you, and we are out to stop the fleecing and actually unleash your potential and protect you. And that argument has to be made universally across the audiences. You make it differently. You get to those audiences differently, but that's what has to be done.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
But the problem is that some people in the political arena think the way to win back the suburbs is to try to outdo the Democrats on Democrat talking points.
Well,
that is a failing strategy.
That's it. So the way to win the suburbs is to try and hold on to the suburbs with the same arguments and the arguments of the left. And so this is the real problem.
Right.
And you see this in suburban communities. You see this, frankly, even with Governor Runner. More money for K-12 education. Now, Illinois Policy Institute has taken some positions that are not particularly popular in even Republican-leaning to Republican rock-ribbed suburban communities, like the pension push-down to local school districts. And they said, well, wait a second. Right. The pension push-down, if we have to fund the obligations that we sign onto with our collective bargaining agreements in the local school district, then all of a sudden we have to substantially increase property taxes, our property tax levy. Certainly we have to max it out under tax caps, quote unquote, in order to make ends meet. And this means you're depriving education dollars from the classroom. So you're defunding our schools by making us responsible for the obligations we voluntarily incurred. We don't want that responsibility. So that's a little bit more complicated to distill what they're doing than it is for them to say, hey, that's the state's responsibility. We want to provide more education dollars in the classroom, in Glen Ellen, in Wilmette.
Where they're spending $20,000 a student.
Right. But you're trying to defund our schools by making us finance these responsibilities. Well, that's not right. We're not on board with that. And so that's where you have suburban Republican legislators get all jumpy too, because they don't want to sign on to that because of the short-term political heat that it incurs.
Those people are all cowards.
Okay.
And let me explain the truth of it. So that is the left's argument.
Yeah.
And of course, the underlying premise of that argument is false. The underlying premise is that if you push down what I like to call vertical accountability, that the pension costs should be borne by those who hire the individual, provide the salary, and decide whether to continue to employ them for 20 or 30 years. That the pension cost for the employer's share should be borne by that unit of government, as opposed to having the state essentially subsidize it. Okay, the local
and impose the benefits.
And the state actually negotiates the benefits, and you have no control over it.
Right. So it's both sides of it.
Right. The whole point of having vertical accountability is to make every unit of government accountable for their decisions. The false premise is that the only choice then is to raise property taxes. That is not true. The other choice is to look at your entire spending and say, okay, let's look at how we spend money and recalibrate. Let's spend money a little differently. Let's be innovative like the village of Grays Lake, the village of Lindenhurst, the village of Glenview, all of whom have been very innovative. Not perfect, but innovative. And they're actually the tip of the spear on some of these things. Public-private partnerships, competitive bidding, outsourcing, forcing the unionized workforce to compete with private sector workforces, not have monopoly control over your snow plowing, your garbage pickup, and all the other your IT services, all the other things that your village pays for, actually forcing them to respond to market forces and drive down cost and actually get better service because there's competition. That is the way progressive local leaders think. They say, okay, we're going to be accountable for that. And so here's one simple example that Ted Dabrowski from our team came up with. He went and looked at what's called, this gets a little into the weeds, but it's a simple idea. With all pensions, the employee pays a share and the employer pays a share. As we've just said, the state pays the employer share. The employee theoretically is paying part of their pensions. What local school districts do is they pick that up in 2/3 of the school districts in the state. So the employee pays none. As a negotiated item, the local school district also picks that up. Well, what they could do is stop picking it up, and it would more than offset that push down of the cost. And so it's a wash. So it actually doesn't cost them anything in 2/3 of the school districts in the state. And when you actually run the numbers, it's we're talking about 2, 3, 4% that you have to come up with in savings. This is something that an innovative trustee, village president, village manager can do in a heartbeat. But here's why they don't do it, Dan. They don't do it because the political pain of that is harder than saying, no, 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 don't do this other thing that we're talking about.
Totally. And also, they can blame shift to the state. And I mean, the argument that you just made, well, that doesn't fit nicely on a mail piece where you're limited to
you actually have to think a little bit.
60 words or less.
Right.
And the response from the other side is to say, well, you're against teachers? Are you against paying our teachers?
Right.
Are you against educating our children? We have the best schools in the world in Wheaton, in Glen Ellen.
That's a lie too, by
in
the
the
way.
North Shore, in northwest suburban Cook County, in Will County, all of the upper to higher income suburban communities, River Forest, Oak Park, same thing. It's the same argument over and over again. You're against teachers, you're against educating our children, you want to rob our kids. You know the rhetoric, you've seen it in commercials and so forth. And so for politicians, what you're talking about requires engagement and a conversation. What they're talking about, and what the Republican Party has largely bought into in this state, comes back to flag waving. Is my bullet point more powerful than your bullet point? And the fact is that, the provision of government of largesse from somebody else's pocket is more compelling than your dot-connected argument about what could be.
That's why your whole point about property taxes, which I have fully embraced and agree with, our team's done a lot of work on this as well, is so powerful. Because it's property taxes that are the clarifying point. It's property taxes that strip that all away. Because now the argument is, do you want to keep your house, or are you going to ask your school district, your village, your township to reform? Because either you can keep your house, or keep paying the freight, or you can force your local leaders, your local political leaders, to begin to be innovative and reform. It's your choice.
So how does our dollars and cents argument compete with their sob story?
By talking about the sob story of the individual homeowner that is trying to figure out whether or not they can go on vacation anymore, whether they can go out to dinner anymore, whether they can afford the tutor for their kid who can't read or write because the public school system is actually failing a lot of students in their community despite its great reputation. And by the way, the people who create those great reputations, it's like if I took a test and graded myself, I'm doing pretty good. Right? They grade themselves and say how great they are. If you actually look at the objective evidence, most of these school systems are not nearly as spectacular as we would all love to believe. But the way the sob story is comparing the sob story of the teacher to the sob story of the homeowner. And that is why I believe we're at the fulcrum point. We're at an inflection point because it's penetrating in a way that, so people are going to be open to the arguments now in a way they've never been before. And asking somebody to save 3, 4, 5% and reform the ongoing spending structures with public employee pensions, close down the defined benefit program, put everybody on 401k just like everybody else is in the private sector, that has greater resonance today than it's ever had. We've been doing this for years. And the public's receptivity to this is at an all-time high. We have a ways to go. It's not done. We have a ways to go. But the trend lines are in our direction. And that's why it takes this is the perfect time for political leadership to emerge to pick up these ideas and run with them because the public's ready.
Well, and I mean, in terms of like the landscape, talking about the landscape, people lament. The conversation is my strategy from Illinois, no matter where you go, right? I mean, I'm retired in a couple of years, we're out. Kids are out of school in a couple of years, we're out. And it's, Chicago. We need to separate Chicago from the state. It needs to become its own state. It needs to be annexed by Indiana or Wisconsin. By the way, there are no takers. But Chicago's at its lowest population level since 1920 for all the reasons that we're kicking around. And yet it seems to be at its apex with respect to political power relative to the rest of the state. And so...
Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, just in terms of people suggesting that the real challenge is to, taking a position that is not feasible or achievable, de-annexing from Chicago. So it's its own state.
Not going to happen.
Right, of course. And, the argument I always make, Chicago's been part of Illinois since 1818, since our incorporation. It's, we've won elections since then, and when it was much bigger.
Right.
But we can't win elections now when it's much smaller. So
that's why there's so much opportunity for the political class that believes in what we're talking about to win.
But this is a competitive landscape. Is the other side gets to participate.
Right.
We are also given the opportunity to participate as Republicans or free marketeers, whether you're affiliated with the Republican Party or not. And we kind of concede that Chicago is this bastion of leftism that cannot be penetrated. And yet, as we're sitting here today, there are 4 Republican candidates who've announced to run for mayor of New York City against the socialist Bill de Blasio, including a 35-year-old Latina New York Assemblywoman, a member of the legislature in New York. And we've, of course, seen Giuliani and Bloomberg as Republican or center-right candidates that have actually won the mayorship of New York. But here, we haven't had a center-right candidate challenge the Democrats in Chicago since 1987 when Don Hayter ran from, the business professor from Northwestern University. So why is that?
Well, I think it goes back to the bankruptcy of the Republican establishment. The Republican establishment was part and parcel of the problem, going back, say, mid-2000s back. The Republican establishment had no interest in challenging the orthodoxy that the Democrats shall always control Cook in Chicago and, in some aspects, the General Assembly.
Well, do they now? I mean, Ronner and Rahm are part of the same wine club, and Rahm is a good friend of the governor's.
I don't think that's true anymore.
Well, he may not be a good friend anymore now that they're in competitive offices, where the mayor is spending a lot of time blaming the governor, and the governor spending a lot less time telling the mayor that you've made your bed, lie in it.
Right.
But we still, in 2015, where you had a very weak incumbent mayor of Chicago being Tiny Dancer, he had a neat...
Tiny Dancer?
Tiny Dancer is...
Did you coin that?
Yes, I did, and it's become popularized through my repetitiveness about Rahm Emanuel. But he had, kind of titular competition from very weak Democrat candidates. We didn't field a candidate. He's up for re-election in 2019, basically concurrent with the governor's re-election in November of 2018, and there's no prospect for a Republican candidate here. So people look around and they say, I would say this argument, and it's a rational one. One of the reasons I say the impossible, Chicago becoming its own state or de-annexing from Chicago or something of this sort, is because the Republicans aren't providing any competition in Chicago. And so if they're not going to provide any competition, all I'm left with is to say, kick Chicago out of Illinois and make it its own state. That's not going to happen. But they're essentially suggesting, is the rational, sometimes engaged voter, well, that's no less ridiculous than the Republicans fielding a candidate, because I haven't seen one in 30 years.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because I think this goes to one of my favorite topics, which is when the Republicans lose territory. Go all the way back to Don
Hayter.
Hayter. It was before my time.
Well, how about just to punctuate this before you get to your point, in South Suburban Cook County. So I cut my teeth working for the speaker and then minority leader, that 2-year interregnum of Madigan reign in 94 to 96.
One of my favorite words, interregnum.
It's a great word. It's a great word. If you go to the opera, you'll get a better appreciation for it. But I'm a man of letters.
I've been to the opera
You're
once.
a man of Michigan.
I slept through most of it.
So here's the thing. The South suburbs controlled by Democrats. Controlled by Republicans. 96 with Punch Town, when we had straight ballot voting, they swept all the Republicans out. That's when Jack O'Malley lost the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the highest ranking Republican at the time and since. And it's been all Democrats. And Republicans have abdicated from South Suburban Cook County, despite all the things we said earlier in our conversation about South Suburban Cook County and the destruction wrought by Cook County Democrats on South Suburban Cook County.
Right.
And those families.
Yeah, they own that.
Most of whom who could get out are in Will County or Indiana now. And the poor that couldn't get out are being blitzed from every direction. But we ceded all that turf. So South Suburban Cook County we cede after we've ceded Chicago proper for 100 years. And so they say, well, here's what Republicans do. They lose and they run. Here's what Democrats do. They lose and they re-up until they win, like they did on the North Shore. At the same time that we're ceding South Suburban Cook County, the Democrats are still losing on the North Shore, but then they started winning in the mid-90s, and now we haven't seen a Republican there since Beth Colson retired. Now you don't have a Republican from the Will County border to the Wisconsin border, west to like Waukegan Road, all the way up the lakefront from Will County to Wisconsin.
Right.
And so, I mean, why should people not feel despondent about the Republican Party and its willingness to put in the fight?
Because the Republican Party is never going to do what's necessary to take it back. That was the point I was going to make. You just made the point I was going to make, but I'll make it better.
Of course, please.
Well, for the first time ever, someone's going to make a point better than you.
That's hard to believe.
It is very hard to believe, and the audience will judge whether I do this or not. The problem on the right, whether it's Republican or conservatives or whatever, is that when they lose territory, they cede it and it's gone forever. They just accept the premise that it's gone forever. And as you pointed out, when Democrats lose a geographic area, they go back, they regroup and say, why did we lose? What can we do to win? And the work you're doing, the work I'm doing, the work all of the people we're associated with are doing is trying to change that you can go back into these territories and actually win. The challenge of it is that it's difficult and it's hard because you got to go back and make arguments and win people over. But voters are not static. The best example of this is the state of Michigan, where I grew up. I've been here 32 years. This is my home. I've made this, made my whole life here. But I grew up in Michigan, and when I left Michigan, Michigan was auguring in. The bumper stickers, literally, the bumper stickers were last one to leave, turn out the lights. Everybody was heading to Texas. Sound familiar? And everybody was assuming, as the demise in the 80s of the auto industry and all the rest of it, that Michigan was never going to recover. It did eventually recover because voters are not static. And the other thing I heard all the time was, it's all Republicans that are leaving. That's not true. The people that are leaving the state of Illinois are Democrat, Republican, Independent in a somewhat equal way. The people think that party identity is always the superior idea. No, it's not. The superior idea is your personal opportunity and prosperity, the quality of your life. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican or an Independent. What matters is your feeling about your future and the opportunity for your future in a given place. People leave because they think they have better opportunity elsewhere, whether Democrat or Republican. What people who believe what we're talking about have to do is make an argument about the ideas and try to address the issue that voters are not static and they're persuadable, but you have to persuade them in a way that is consumable. You can't persuade them with talking points and phrases and feel-good narratives. You have to actually persuade them with a vision and substantive policy that will change their lives, that penetrates.
No, but people say, and I want you to address this, people say all the time, I hear this out in the hustings, we're past the tipping point. We have more people that are the beneficiaries of the status quo, the public sector unions, the government officials, their coterie,
right,
than we do the productive class. Even if they have some presence here, they're not residents here, so they can't affect elections here. And so we can't get this back. It's going to have to all come crashing down and we'll have to have some kind of Detroit-like event statewide before we can resuscitate Illinois. Why isn't that true?
It's not true because the numbers show it's not true. In fact, you're very familiar with some numbers that we put together that analyzed by voting district. One of the things I've always been fascinated by is how many state reps who are Republican are completely paranoid every day about public sector unions and the union vote in their own district. So we actually went and did the numbers, as you know. And I think the low is like 0.5% to 1 or 2 or 3%. And if you expand the universe to direct union members and their friends and family sort of thing, it might be 3, 4, 5%. But they're not dominating these the voting blocks. They're dominating the noise because they're organized and they have resources. But there are other voters out there waiting to be gotten if somebody makes an argument. And the problem is that people who run on the right, and generally putting on the Republican label, are terrified to make an argument.
Yeah.
Part of what we try to do is empower them to make arguments and to help them understand that if you make that argument, there are voters out there. A great example of this is right to work. In Michigan, going back to Michigan, they passed right to work in 2012. And the union said, all you people who vote for right to work, you're going to lose your seat. You know how many people have lost an election because they voted for right to work? Zero.
In Michigan.
In Michigan. And this is, but it's not just Michigan, this is true across the state.
Well, I mean, if
across
it's
the country.
if it's in Michigan,
I mean, Michigan, home of the
workers,
UAW,
yeah,
right? You know, as unionized as Illinois. The problem is a lack of leadership. It's about leadership. It's about making the argument relentlessly and not giving up on the argument just because it doesn't take root the first time you make it. This is about repetition. You know, you tiny dancer, you know, you've been using that for a long time. Someday it's actually going to catch on.
Yes.
But this is true of all these ideas we're talking about. You have to make this argument repetitively. And as I said earlier, we have moved the bar in terms of where the electorate is. They're coming our way. Democrat, Republican, Independent alike. Now, it's not easy, and turning out voters is different than turning out changing sentiment. But the problem is an absence of leadership on the Republican side and the conservative side.
So how do we change the culture to incentivize the leadership to be more courageous than they're otherwise inclined to be? I mean, I had this conversation recently when I was addressing a group in Villa Park, York County Republican organization, York Township Republican organization in DuPage County, and I got this question. I got this statement from a Elmhurst village trustee. Elmhurst, this is rock-ribbed Republican territory. Well, the state has no money, and so with respect to my property tax proposal of capping property taxes at 1% of home value like Indiana does, well, the state's out of money. The state has no money. I said, wait a second. The state has $60 billion a year. That's not no money. That's
That's
$60 billion.
lot of money.
But what it says is they've won the cultural battle. They've won the argument, and we've seeded the argument by starting from their premise to say, yep, the state's out of money. That's why we have $12 billion in unpaid bills. That's why we have $250 billion in debt, because the state has no money. No, the state has all kinds of money, and we have the highest combined state and local tax burden in the country.
Right.
And we're the worst, we're the state that's in the worst financial condition. Those two are connected.
Right.
Because they are termites. They are rapacious. They will go through other people's money like termites go through wood. And so you have to say, we have $60 billion, start from zero. What are we going to spend that money on that's reflective of our values and our priorities, rather than assuming the baseline that the left starts from? But the left has won that argument to say, this is the baseline we start from. The state has no money. And so it's a revenue problem, not a spend problem. It's a revenue problem, not a system problem. And you have Republican leaders at the local level that are at the village meeting every month that we're not at, starting from the left's premise.
Well, we have to keep working on that. That is part of what we have to do. And that we have to turn that person into an outlier. And actually, we're a long ways down the road toward doing that. We really are. We're much further down the road than your narrative implies. But we're not there yet. And I think this is a great opportunity for the governor. The governor has a tremendous opportunity to take all of what we're talking about here and synthesize it into a coherent message about all of this. And the bottom line is that the reason we are in trouble is not because of a lack of revenue. It's because we have three core drivers of spending. And the way I always like to put it, it's a very simple problem. Spending rises faster than revenues. That's what's going on. And so the only way to stop this problem is to make spending, President Obama used to like to talk about bending the cost curve, right, of healthcare. We need to bend the spending curve. Public employee compensation and all that entails, pensions, benefits, salaries. Got to reform that. And you got to make that argument furiously and relentlessly up and down the food chain. And if he makes that argument, which I think he's about to, that will start to resonate and actually empower others to continue to make that argument. Secondly, Medicaid and healthcare spending in general in this state. It's the second biggest driver of spending. And there's, as an example, we allow in this state, unlike other states, able-bodied people who could be working and there are jobs available to get full Medicaid benefits. Taking those benefits away from people who literally cannot work, who are disabled either mentally or physically or in some other way, there's not enough money for people to get treatment who are truly the most vulnerable because we've allowed people to be on the dole of Medicaid when they're able-bodied and should be working and get health insurance through their employers or through an exchange by working and paying. And these arguments have to be made by political leaders, and the governor has a tremendous opportunity to do that. He's not done that yet in a way that has penetrated, and I think that the landscape is now ripe for him to do that, and he needs to do that.
So if it's a leadership problem, then that necessarily means that the House Republican leader, Jim Durkin, and the Senate superminority leader, Christine Rodano, and the governor, who's been in office for 2.5 years, have not provided the leadership on these matters. Isn't that necessarily logically follow?
Yes.
Okay, so if they haven't done it for the last 2.5 years, and in the case of Durkin and Rodano for many years prior to the Governor Rauner's election, then why are they going to do it now?
Remember when I talked earlier about the call center business and that financial desperation creates great motivation for people to do a job that otherwise is miserable, but they earn really good money in the short period of time by doing that? That's true in politics. Political desperation breeds innovation and change. And the governor is in a bad spot for his reelect. He's got well-funded opponents who are
Why?
Well, because they haven't done exactly what you just said. That's exactly why they're in this problem. They're in this problem because they've gotten completely buried in the minutia of governance instead of making an argument to the people of Illinois about what needs to change. And they've gotten so involved in the grand bargain, the process, the budget, all of which is important, but it is not determinative. What is determinative is the people choosing sides. And the sides are very clear. The sides are the political establishment and the elite class that have been running this state into the ground for decades in a bipartisan fashion and keeping these constructs in public employee compensation and all that entails, the trial bar and all that entails, and all those who feed off the system, nonprofits and others, and all that entails. That has to be changed so that so the order right now is who's at that $60 billion, who's at the front of the line? Those people I just named. The people that need to be at the front of the line are the poorest among us, the developmentally disabled that you talk about a lot, and others who truly are struggling, that we want to have a compassionate society, that we actually care for people who struggle. We want to make sure kids in the city, Chicago, East St. Louis, Rockford, Decatur, get a great education. You have to completely reform the systems. He has to make arguments. They have to make arguments on these issues with the policies that are known to work anywhere else they've been tried. They work everywhere else they've been tried. What I find so fascinating is how closed-minded and parochial this state is to outside ideas that actually have been proven to work elsewhere. They have to adopt that, and I believe desperation will get them there, because in the end, elected officials are about getting reelected. And right now, they think they're going to get reelected by just mimicking the Democrat talking points. No, I think they're going to...
Which is why we've been in the minority or super minority for generations. I mean, that's the thing that's so curious about this is, wait a second.
Pass me your fire there, Dan.
The idea, I mean, we've been doing this for generations and generations and generations. And all of the money that's been taxed and spent and borrowed and spent, and we find ourselves in all of these school districts that you're talking about in the very same position. Right. And we find ourselves one of the worst in the nation in providing services to the developmentally or intellectually disabled, the population that needs state services through no fault of their own, that every politician says they're in public office to serve. And yet they won't make the argument that says this system
is broken.
These systems don't provide what you think and what you're sending your tax dollars to Springfield to provide. And so that's why we need to do it, going back to the human cost. Right. To me, that's not a complicated argument.
It's what the governor ran on in 2014.
And the data bears it out, right? I mean, what did the governor, to your point, what did Ronner say in 2014? And including in his his victory speech in November of 2014, we can't have compassion without competence.
Right.
Those two are connected. If we're a competent government, then we can be a compassionate government because we can provide for those who we all want to provide for, who need those services, who need the provision of support from the state. And we're not in that place 2.5 years later. And so why is it illegitimate for people to say, well, you know, I tried Ronner because Quinn was incompetent and therefore he couldn't be compassionate. But now Ronner has proven not to be the turnaround artist that he advertised himself to be. And so maybe it's a Democrat plus a Democrat-controlled legislature that will provide the competence that provides compassion.
So we're going to go back to monopoly control of the Democrat Party that created the crisis in the first place.
Well, right, but people have short memories.
There's no question that's true, and I think that I agree that that's a real risk. It's a real risk. I think one of the mistakes the governor's made that I hope he abandons is this whole idea of embracing the tax hike. You know, this conventional wisdom that you can't solve this problem without a tax hike. I understand why he's using a tax hike as a lever to negotiate. I get that. What I don't understand is going so far as to just, you know, signal and over-signal that he's willing to do a small to big tax hike without first forcing the spending cuts and spending reforms, structural reforms, to be on the table. He should go back to that. He should go back to talking about the general fund, the general revenue fund. You said $60 billion, which is, there's three different numbers. For the sake of simple numbers, the numbers that the state of Illinois most directly controls are the general revenue fund. It's roughly $33 billion. And that is where the real problem is within that $33 billion, because all the other money comes out of various other funds in the federal government. The $33 billion of revenue we expect is near an all-time high. The only time it was slightly higher was during the tax hike from 2011 through the December of 2014. It got up to, I think, $36-ish billion. But we can live on $33 billion if we reform the drivers of spending. That is the argument he has to make, and he has to make the argument within the context of how it affects you as a homeowner and why your property taxes can actually go, not just freeze your property taxes at the record high rates, let's actually cut them. That's one of the arguments you've been making that I think is really good. Why would you freeze the record highest tax rates? You know, when I first heard freeze, I sort of was enthusiastic about that, but as you pointed out and others have pointed out, that why would we want to freeze failure? Let's not freeze failure. Let's drive it down and force the reforms on all units of government. One of the things people miss out on and why they need to pay more attention to their local government is that more money is actually spent at the local level than the state level. It's where the real spending takes place. It's where the real headcounts are. Your school districts, your townships, your villages, your cities, your towns.
Not to mention the real impact on your quality of life, your schools, the local community in which you live every day.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you're painting a fairly dark picture, but I actually think that it reminds me a little bit of, I've told this story before when you've been around, but it reminds me of when I was in East Berlin for a day in September of 1988. Let me tell you, you only want
that's a bright picture compared to Illinois to East Berlin.
It's pretty close, actually. Totalitarian. Yeah, everything's gray.
We don't have a wall yet.
One time Quinn sarcastically proposed, I think, taxing people as they leave the state. That I may be wrong on that. It could be hyperbole, but the point of this is I was there and nobody imagined that wall would come down 14 months later. But the predicates were actually in place when I was there. You just couldn't see them. And I believe the predicates are there. But it's not inevitable. There are things that happened between September of 1988 and November of 1989 when the wall came down that had to happen. It took leadership. And that's why I keep emphasizing this. If the political class, Durkin, Radonio, and members of the General Assembly, but especially the governor, if they don't pick up the mantle of leadership on these issues, it's not going to happen. So this is the moment of crisis, and all great leaders rise in the moment of crisis, and footnotes don't.
Well, and this is an important point going back to the Illinois Policy Institute and the work that your think tank / do tank does. Because the criticism, of course, of Illinois Policy Institute, of me, as well as, well, we're just flacks for Governor Ronner. And so whatever he does is great because he's the Republican governor and the others are Democrat legislative leaders and legislative majorities. And I want you to address that because my sense is, and my conversations with you, is that the whole point of the Illinois Policy Institute is to extend beyond the political life of any singular politician. But of course, people are just in the now, and so they see alliances and they say, well, those alliances are just about the immediate alliances. They're not about the big picture, the long term.
It's one of my favorite topics because I hear this all the time. The Illinois Policy Institute was around long before Governor Rauner ever thought about running for governor. And it'll be around long after he's done being governor, whether that's in 18 months or in 6 years. And the purpose of the Illinois Policy Institute is not to advance a candidate or an elected official. The purpose of the Institute and all the work that we do is to advance a cause. And that cause is what I talked about at the beginning of this discussion, which is to advance the cause of human freedom, to advance the cause of human prosperity, particularly in that sense of the human spirit. That's why we exist. That is what our agenda is. It's very simple. And I happen to think that this governor is the best chance we have right now. Is he perfect? I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. None of us are perfect.
Oh.
But he's done a very good job overall in very difficult circumstances. But the bottom line is he has to get better. And I think he's ready to get better and advance the cause in a different way than he has, because he's tried a particular approach. For whatever reason, he's tried the approach that got him to this spot. And it hasn't worked. So now he gets to make a choice. Do I change my approach to try to make an argument to the people along the lines of what we're talking about, or do I continue with my same arc of the narrative, arc of the policy, arc of the strategy? And I don't think he's going to. I think he's going to change. And I think he's going to change because he's a competitor. And I know him well. I know him pretty well. And he's a competitor. And I think he's going to change. I think it's hard to change, though. I think it's hard to be in that chair. It's not a simple thing. It is easy when you're sitting on the outside. I have some insight into it, and I think it's very difficult. But I do think he's going to change. And of course, part of that is my eternal optimism, and I am hopeful he will change. But it's essential that he changes. But our job at the Institute is not to advance him. Our job at the Institute is to advance the policies that will change the human condition of the people of Illinois. And so long as he is an advocate of that, we're going to, from a policy point of view, be helpful to that. But we've had our disagreements with him.
Yeah.
We've had our disagreements with him on a whole variety of things. His whole negotiating posture, from the beginning, we've had our disagreements on. His whole approach from a marketing point of view, we've had our disagreements on.
The utility bailout bill.
The utility bailout bill, which we thought was a travesty. I mean, it's a perfect illustration of what they shouldn't have done, because it perpetuates the system that's been in place for a very long time. It picks winners and losers and all the rest of it. But overall, our job is to try to, I'm not a purist. I am a pragmatic ideologue. And when I say an ideologue, I'm absolutely an ideologue, and I embrace that term, and more people should. I believe that human freedom is the greatest force for good to improve the human condition for the poorest among us especially, and for everybody. It's the great benefit of it. You can help those who want to rise at the same time as you're helping everybody else. You don't have to pick winners and losers.
So coming full circle, back to your entrepreneurship. The good entrepreneur, the productive risk taker, always contemplates and protects for the downside.
Right.
So the downside is that Governor Rauner doesn't win re-election. How does the Illinois Policy Institute, how does the Free Minds and Free Markets movement extend in 2019 if the governor of Illinois is not Bruce Rauner?
Well, that's a great question. The short answer is Jennifer Granholm. When this happened in Michigan, when Jennifer Granholm won re-election in that case, and got another 4 years of her insane approach to governance, everybody thought Michigan was going to be dead forever. 4 years later, you had total Republican control of every aspect of government. And the reason is at some point, the people do learn, and the people do listen, and the people do engage. I hope it's 2018 when the people begin to vote for it. And I don't care if somebody's a Democrat, Republican. I care that they want to advance the policy agenda. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. You've supported Democrats. I've supported Democrats. I've supported people that agree with me on some issues and disagree with me on others, because I thought they're going to overall advance the broad spectrum of policy. So it's not just about party affiliation. It really comes down to the establishment, mobocracy, as I think you call it, that is ruining the state, versus the people. And the people are bipartisan. The people are actually not even partisan. The people just want to have a better opportunity. And so if he loses, we'll go back, recalibrate, and fight for another day. And we'll continue to do the work we need to do to prepare, because we know that if one of the Democrats wins, they're going to choose the continuation of that which has destroyed the state, and then it'll be riper. And those that are left, I believe, whether it's 2020 or 2022, will eventually come to our way of thinking. And we have to keep that mindset. But I'd rather have it happen in 2018.
He is John Tillman, the Chief Executive Officer of the Illinois Policy Institute, illinoispolicy.org, our guest on this edition of Against the Current. Thank you for joining us, John. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.